So we don't get the name Jew or Judaism necessarily until quite late, a little bit surprisingly late, perhaps. And that's
Hmm.
because when the Persian Empire, and they called the place Yehud.
Dr. Pytlik, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me.
I'm
Um,
excited. Thank you.
Aside from what we learn from the Bible, or for some Americans, perhaps many, what they see in the movies and TV, what does scholarship tell us about the origin of the Jewish people?
As with most things in Jewish history, I always start off by saying it's complicated. It's a long story.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess to take that, what I think you mean here is when can we identify the people, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't get the name Jew or Judaism necessarily until quite late, a little bit surprisingly late, perhaps. And that's
Hmm.
because when the Persian Empire ruled the area, ruled the larger Eastern Mediterranean, they set up sort of governmental units called satrapies. And those were based on probably what they considered to be and what they learned to be the natives, so who was living there.
So this is the
So
first Persian Achaemenid Empire, the one that was toppled by Alexander the Great, right?
right, so this is around, yeah, give or take 500 BC, 400 BC,
Hmm.
400. Okay, so that's the Persian period archaeologically, and they called the place Yehud. But how do we trace that further back? We trace that further back because by then the people already knew their identity. So when we want to take it further back in time, are they Jews prior to this, the way we think of them today? Yeah, the ancestors for sure. But when we go all the way back to, say, the stories of Abraham and even David, for example, and others, they would not have said the word Jew or Jewish. They may have understood Judah, meaning the place, the location, but they probably wouldn't have said that. They would have most likely said perhaps Hebrew, or I'm the follow the sons of, given patriarch, this type of thing, that type of thing. An Israelite, I don't even know if they would have used that. But, there's a certain time when now we have the name Jew, Judaism, Judah. But then again, it doesn't really become the forerunner of modern Judaism until even after in the Roman period, perhaps. So
Interesting.
complicated. So today in Israel, for example, if you are to talk about a Jew, you would use the word Yehudi or
Okay.
Yehudi, for a feminine.
So would did Yehudis, that this term Yehud that came before the word Jew or Judaism, were they Jewish?
Again, it's a long process of what we look at anthropologically and historically, which is kind of where I am most expert in this stuff as far as my work. It's a process that really we can start to identify around about the year ish 1200 BC. There's a period of time there between, say, 1200 BC and 1000 BC when a process that one Israeli scholar calls ethnogenesis occurs. How do we,
Ethnogenesis. Okay.
the beginning of the identity, the traits? So, in this period, if one were to say, well, what's the Bible say about this? The book of Judges is close. There's a lot of theological things going on in the book of Judges, of course, but there are some glimmers of historical sort of memory, if you will. And in that period of time, we have a number of processes that are going on in the Near East, including the arrival of the Sea Peoples, the collapse of the Middle Bronze Age kingdoms, one after another. We're starting to learn more about this. It caused a revolution insofar as government, how people in groups ruled themselves. The lack of the big city states, those had collapsed, they weren't safe anymore. So we have a sort of a revolution that way. And we also have some processes going on within what we know as Israel today, with the arrival of the Sea Peoples, most notably what we know as the Philistines and others, that these small nation states are starting to come to fore. Israel seems to be quite late in that process, a little bit late. They're a little bit behind the times because they're really not sure about the idea of a king. They really have a hard time with this at first. But when we start to look at the archaeological remains in this period, relatively short, 1200 to 1000, it's known as the Iron Age 1 in Israel. This is called the Israelite period. And we see there that they start to solidify ideas. Now, how do we know about this? We get it through textual and archaeological remains. So, for example, they start to reject the older Canaanite forms of government, how they live, what they eat is very interesting. And it seems to be that other less tangible ways of digging things up, like the idea of circumcision and other things, become relevant in this time when we look at a cross-section of the texts, the traditions, and the archaeology. So we can start to see that by in the future from 1200, about 1000 BC, we have evidence of a kingdom established. And then we start to see from then on those cultural traits that had been developed over a couple hundred years really go forward, and they stay in the culture all the way through. So that's why we can then say these people are the ethnogenesis of the Jewish people. Now, go ahead.
Let me peel that back for a moment, please. Ethnogenesis. And before we started our podcast conversation, I referred to some of my earlier readings, kind of vague. That's why I'm asking the question. Were they a collection? By they I mean the Jewish people, Yahud, or the earlier name for it. Were they a collection of different peoples that converted to Judaism? Does that question make sense in this context?
So it does. It just depends on when, because the idea of a conversion in say the biblical period, it's not this. It wasn't the same at all what it is, say, for today. It's much different. It really is modern Judaism, and then there's biblical Judaism. These are quite different.
Okay.
Context, quite different, sort of traits, rituals, etc. But there's a core base idea. The ideas propel forward in time and become enshrined within Judaism.
I see.
Okay.
We keep on talking about Judaism, Dr. Pytlik. For these ancient times, is it more appropriate to talk about Yahwism?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's one way to look at it. Again,
Could you describe that for us, please? What is Yahweh and how does it relate to Judaism?
All right. So this is a term. It's surprisingly misunderstood, I think. And it's also one that can cause great emotion.
Emotion. Okay.
Yeah. So I, for one, have learned the hard way sometimes not to use that name in, say, a formal Jewish learning context where people are coming maybe from all different backgrounds, whether they're religious or not. They have a problem with that word because we're not supposed to say it. Now,
you mean you're not supposed to utter it?
Well, here's the problem with that, because
is it sacred? Go ahead, please.
It's a sacred name that refers to the 4-letter name of God in the Hebrew Bible. So it's the Yud He Vav He. Yud He Vav He in Hebrew is unpronounceable. It's a name that is given to the Jewish people along the way, and it's supposed to be the name that's used for all time, according to the texts. Now, the problem is, what do we do with this name? So a lot of theology developed around this. This term, Yahweh, again, is sort of an attempt by later scholars in the more modern age to really try to understand what this word is. And so,
does it mean God?
It refers to the idea of God, but it's more of a personal name. But again, we have to look at other contexts. When Moses first receives the name, It's not a name, it's a phrase, it's a verb in a sense. So if we were to look at the grammatical construction of Yud He Vav He in Hebrew, it's a combination of several things: the future tense, the present tense, and the past tense all together of the word to be. So really, if we wanted to, talk it out, we would have to say, I will be that which I will be, which is another name given in Exodus. So
Oh, wow.
there's a great sermon, by the way. God's name is a verb, right? Means to, always be, or will be, has been, forever being, forever changing, all this sort of thing. Really some good stuff there. So we're,
God's name is a verb. I'm going to have to remember that. That's profound. Okay.
yeah. When Moses goes to Sinai and he has this interaction, theophany with God, he gets the laws and he's supposed to go down and get them ratified by the people. Well, the people don't know this God. And so Moses says to God, who am I supposed to say sent me to them? Because if I come down with all these rules, they're not going to believe me. Who's sending me? And God says, tell them, I will be that which I will be sent you. Well, okay, that sounds great. And then in the Hebrew text, mixed in with Elohim and other Canaanite sort of remnants of the idea of God, we get this 4-letter name. Now, Jewish tradition is very explicit. So we cannot write it. We cannot erase it for sure. Writing means eventually it could be erased, and you don't want to blot out the name of God. That's a very strong idea. Nor can you say it. And why can't we say it? Because number one, we don't know how to say it in Hebrew because it's not a proper name like we would say, Samuel or Miriam or anything else, right? It's not one of those kind of names. It's almost impossible to say in Hebrew. That's not going to stop a modern scholar who is studying text. They're going to try to figure this out.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's how we get the idea when they look at Hebrew and they say, well, it kind of would sound like we get the words like Jehovah or Yahweh, that
Oh.
type of thing. And so scholars in the Middle Ages, theologians and others would say, we can't say it, so what do we do with it? We can't say it because you're diminishing the idea of the one creator by saying its name. You're diminishing, and you're referring to that idea. You're diminishing God, in other words, so you should not say it. So what do? We say, when we get into the text, like prayer books and such, when we see that word coming, congregations will not say it, but they will say Adonai.
Repeat that, please. They say what?
Adonai.
Which means?
Or Adoni, like the more formal way of saying Lord.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so we don't want to say, now I have said, because in scholarship you'll see the word Yahweh, you'll see it, because they're not so worried always about the religious perspective necessarily. They are, but they will say Yahweh. So when you ask the question, is it Yahwism? Yes, but the Hebrew Bible is always it's tricky, and it's got a lot of stuff packed in from older times and myths and all kinds of statements it's trying to make. And so while there's Yahweh or Elohim or all these other names, there's also Canaanite gods running around. And the
which really puzzles me about this period. And I want to ask a question, but I think even the words that I'm going to use for that question may be a little problematic. Let's go back to what you said. Moses comes down from the mountain and people don't know this God. So he's trying to identify somehow who gave us these 10 commandments, these laws. So I want to ask this question. Let me ask it, then I tell you what my problem with that question is. When did Judaism become a religion? So what is my problem with that question is that I'm not even sure if the term religion makes sense for these ancient times, because I don't know, Canaanites, Elamites, Babylonians, Hittites, they all had their local gods. I'm not sure if they thought of it as religion or something else that is not that is foreign and lost in time to us modern humans, right?
Yeah. So we have a lot of data from archaeology and from other traditions, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
and so it generally, more simplistic way of so we can start to talk about this.
Yeah.
Religion generally is more formalized, perhaps has theological doctrine attached to it, developed concepts, the rites, it's a little bit more conservative, it's a little bit more narrow.
Hmm.
Now, it's in these prior to Judaism, and I haven't gotten to that answer yet, but
Hmm.
prior in the biblical period, for example, it
Hmm.
is okay to say Yahwism, but what does that include? So what we would often say is there's a cult around this, and cult is not a bad word. It doesn't mean a fringy kind of
Yeah.
group or something like this. In the study of religions, the cultus includes everything that goes to that expression of ideas that the people have accepted. So what's part of the cult of Yahweh? Well, the Bible is surprisingly lacking in details about what they did. Now we know they sacrificed animals, not people, sacrificed animals in high places. Those are called, bamot, meaning high places. There seems to have been
By
offerings
high places, you mean elevated from the ground? Is that what you mean?
elevated hills,
Okay.
hilltops, sometimes raised platforms, this type of thing.
Hmm.
Um, Standing stones.
Hmm.
These are an image that we see, not only an image, we read about the story of Jacob and others, but we have many examples in archaeology. We've dug some up. A lot of times in Judean cities, we see them in the city gate, or we see them in rooms set aside as sort of little temples within cities. We've seen a number of these at the excavations I've dug. And so what is the idea here? What goes on inside those rooms? We have a few um, sites that are really helpful, but the Bible doesn't say, this incense stands, stone incense stands,
Hmm.
little what we call God boxes. That's a nickname, but little temple models with no figurines inside it, at least in the Judean context.
Interesting.
Yeah, and we have libation vessels. Now, the Bible doesn't say anything about this. And then when does it become sort of more formalized? We do see in the archaeology that some of these temple rooms in the Judean context, exactly to the point time about the King David, about 1000 BC. I've been able to dig a site for 5 years with Hebrew University that is absolutely stunning with its materials. And what we see there is that there seems to be, a real concern, more so than we do today generally, in the idea of a religion. I'll just use that loosely.
Hmm.
Uh, but at the same time, in other places, we will see figurines like, in some cases, like from Baal, that are warrior figures that are left over from the Canaanites. These figurines, feminine as well, well-known goddesses from the Near East in the Canaanite tradition, Asherah, Astarte,
You mean
others.
these figurines were mixed in one place,
Yeah.
present together
Yeah, so
sometimes?
there aren't, to my knowledge, there aren't any figurines that are supposed to be, that we know of anyway, how to read them, that are representing this Yahweh idea. This,
Hmm.
because we don't have that, because they're told not to do that quite
Yeah.
early.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the Canaanite goddesses are there for various reasons until we get to the Babylonian destruction in 586, the exile, and when they come back, we no longer see that stuff. So Judaism gets a sort of a more formal approach when the idea goes, when the practices go from these sort of worship uh, elements that I just discussed to more of a text based. Because
Interesting. So for a while, based on what you're saying, and correct me if I'm misphrasing or anything, what you just shared with us, for a while, people, Yahud people, Judaic people, worshipped or at least had present several forms of deity. Yahweh was not one of those figurines, but others may have been from local cultures and customs. But
Yep.
when the Babylonian exile occurs, when they return, that's those previous practices of sort of, I don't want to say monotheism, but sort of multiple versions of practice
Mhm.
are erased. Now the text of Bible in and of itself
Right. It becomes
becomes,
Judaism becomes a more portable religion, and the way they could do that was with the emphasis on texts.
yeah,
So
that's fascinating.
when they are exiled to Babylon, the idea is, the thought is, because we have the progression after that of what they did with this material, is they had the written texts, they write more. There's a huge community that develops in Babylon. They produce, and they're there for another 1,000+ years.
When did the Babylonian exodus occur? Exile?
Exile occurred in 586.
586
with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and the exile.
BC.
Not everybody left, not everybody was taken, but enough stayed, went over there. 60 years later, the Persians let them go, but that community thrives. They will produce one of the most authoritative texts, the second great religious text in Judaism, which is the Babylonian Talmud. Okay,
You
so what
mean
does that
some
mean?
Jews stayed back in Babylon?
Sizable. So it wasn't that, apparently it wasn't, it didn't prohibit them, that experience did not prohibit them from study, from textual, transmissions, and writing down the lessons of what happened before. So there's a lot of interesting turns right there. When the people come back, then they rebuild the temple, because it's been destroyed. Now we have the second temple, and the sacrifices and so on continue under the Persian period and later. And the center becomes Jerusalem, and the center becomes the temple, because they have no political power at this point. The Persians are in control, the Greeks are in control, the Romans.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. We'll be back after a short break to talk about the formation of a Jewish country. We'll be back.